Hello, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are in the world. I would like to welcome you to the 11th module of our telecourse, The Way of the Psychonaut. Today, we will look at the failure of traditional psychiatry to differentiate between mystical experiences and psychotic experiences. And I will try to show how this makes it impossible for psychiatry with this very narrow, superficial model of the psyche to understand spiritual and ritual life of humanity, phenomena like shamanism, rites of passage, the ancient mystery of death and rebirth, and the great religions of the world and the mystical tradition, and how it led to pathologizing of the whole ritual and spiritual history of humanity. And I would like to also suggest an alternative when we talk about spontaneous episodes of holotropic experiences as crisis of spiritual opening or transpersonal crisis, or as my late wife, Christina, and myself called it, spiritual emergencies. So I would like to start by looking at the spiritual history and see how many of the great figures of spiritual history who later reached a very important status had actually, during the spiritual opening, very stormy, very challenging experiences that current psychiatry would consider psychotic. So this would be, in the first place, all the shamans whose career typically belongs with what we discussed in earlier modules as the shamanic crisis. We would include here also the challenging experiences of the founders of religions. For example, Jesus and his stay in the desert when he was tempted by the devil, of the experiences of Muhammad, of being led by Archangel Gabriel through the hell and the paradise and the seven heavens. We can look at the experience of Moses and the burning bush. And then, of course, the experiences of the Buddha under the Bo tree, where he experienced the Kamamara, the master of the world illusions. We can look at the experiences of the great yogis like Muktananda, who described these experiences that he had during the 40 years of his travels in India that he described in his book, Play of Consciousness. We can look at the powerful experiences that Ramakrishna had when he experienced his spiritual opening, where at times he was not able to take care of himself and had to be fed and supported by his disciples. So these are all very, very challenging experiences that would be definitely seen as psychotic episodes. So I will go from here to my early research with LSD that I described also earlier, when I started using LSD as an adjunct to psychotherapy, using the series of medium dosages of LSD. And I talked about the healing intelligence of the psyche of my clients that took us to the sources of their problems and the different layers of the coexistence. And then from there to the perinatal level and transpersonal level. And it was difficult to interrupt the LSD session when the session started being very difficult. So I had to stay with my patients. And then when they had these perinatal experiences and later transpersonal experiences, they actually experienced great improvement, and it was a very positive experience in their life. And I saw something similar in my own sessions. So it became very difficult to draw a line, you know, up to this when it was dealing with biography. This was normal psychology. And then once it moved into the perinatal level or the transpersonal level, those were psychotic experiences. And then later when I met Christina, she was involved in a very powerful series of spontaneous experiences of holotropic states that turned out to be very similar to what is described in Indian literature as awakening of Kundalini, awakening of the serpent power. And we worked with these experiences, and again, they proved to be very beneficial. So we saw that there is an important subgroup of these experiences, which I called later holotropic, that actually are not mental diseases, but they are healing, they are transformative. I believe they are evolutionary, and that can also be source of very important new revolutionary data, information. So we started talking about these as spiritual emergency. Now that term spiritual emergency is a play on words. It's from the Latin emergere, which means emerge. And in English, when a situation appears, a critical situation appears suddenly and is surprising, we call it emergency. We have emergency vehicles, we have emergency rooms, but at the same time, that term emergere, emerging, can mean something very positive. So these experiences that we call spiritual emergencies are definitely challenging, but at the same time, they are a great opportunity for emerging to an entirely new level of consciousness. We also frequently referred to the Chinese language, Chinese pictograms. And I would ask here now for the picture number 2, if I can have it. So this is the Chinese sign pictogram for a crisis. And we see that it's composed of 2 other pictograms, which mean danger and opportunity. And this beautifully describes the spiritual emergency, which certainly is a challenging crisis in life, but also an opportunity for a major, major jump in evolution, for personal transformation and healing. So thank you very much for this picture. When we saw that and we talked about it, our workshops and lectures, there were many people who came to us and reported that they experienced something like that. Some of them managed to handle those experiences at home. Others were not so lucky, and they ended up with psychiatry. They got stigmatizing diagnoses. They were hospitalized. They were put on tranquilizers. And then in this workshop, there were also people who were professional psychiatrists, psychologists, or therapists of some other kind. And they told us that they actually have a similar perspective and that they work with these patients. So in 1980, Christina started at SLN something called Spiritual Emergency or Spiritual Emergency Emergence Network. And it just happened by synchronicity that the co-founder of SLN, Dick Price, had several episodes of very challenging holotropic states of consciousness. And in the first 2, he was treated in the an institute institute for living in New Haven, and ended up having a lot of electroshocks and insulin comas. And then for the third episode, he decided to stay at Esalen. There was a log house near Esalen, and he stayed there by himself. And he had a friend, Patrick, supporting him, bringing him food and spending a little time with him, talking. And he very successfully got through this episode without psychiatric help. So he was very open to this idea of spiritual emergency, very excited about it. And he gave us a house at Esalen and 4 work scholars. Those are people who come to Esalen and they have a reasonable, they pay reasonable money. They have their own program and they help at Esalen. They clean the baths, they work in the garden or in the kitchen. And so we got 4 of these and a computer, and we started making connection between people who were able to offer help and people who needed help. And this spiritual emergency network grew very quickly until it outgrew our own resources, and then moved to the Institute of Transpersonal Psychology, where they had students who could be on the hotline and work on the computer. And then after some time, it came to the California Institute of Integral Studies, when towards the end, we got a special small building with a hotline and a computer, and also a person who was answering the calls and helping people to make connection, with people in their area that could offer help. And then, as I mentioned before, Christina and I also lived for some years with the Kundalini process. She had episodes that came on and off, and we worked with them. And so we lectured about this problem, and then we got offer from Jeremy Tarcher from Los Angeles to write 2 books. One book is a compendium of papers of different people who wrote about the alternatives to the understanding of psychosis, beginning with Roberto Assagioli, who wrote a wonderful paper on the crisis of spiritual opening. But there are also papers by Ram Dass, by Jack Kornfield, by John Perry, who was a great pioneer of this kind of approach. There was a story of Anne Armstrong, a great psychic, what was happening to her when her psychic gift was opening. So this was the first book called Spiritual Emergency. And then we wrote our own book, which was called The Stormy Search for the Self. So we'll now return to the subject of spiritual emergency itself. I will first talk about the differential diagnosis, if you want. Every time I mention the term spiritual emergency, there is somebody who is a psychologist, psychiatrist, and would ask, what is the differential diagnosis between spiritual emergency and psychosis? And I have to answer, we cannot establish differential diagnosis because the terms that are used for what we call functional or endogenous psychosis is not really a medical term. This is not described in terms of the medical biological findings. We don't have any findings in blood. We have no findings in urine. We have no findings in the cerebrospinal liquid. No X-ray pictures that would tell us, this is schizophrenia or some other type of psychosis. We just end up with this term functional or endogenous psychosis, which of course doesn't mean anything. Everybody who knows something about medicine knows when we use terms like essential, idiopathic, endogenous, that it basically means we don't have a clue, but we don't tell people that we don't have a clue, so we get a very sophisticated title. So if we don't have actually diagnosis, a medical diagnosis, we cannot talk about differential diagnosis. So the question is, what can we do? What we can do, we can describe the characteristics of these states that would make the patients who have these kinds of experiences good candidates for an alternative approach. People would not have to get tranquilizers and would be able and willing to work to get to the sources of this and actually use the healing and transformative potential. So what would be the characteristics? The first characteristic we look at is that part of the clinical picture of these people would be experiences that we daily see in holotropic breathwork. We take a group of 30 to 400 people, as it was in Moscow. We would see people going back to traumatic experiences from their childhood, from their infancy. We would see people reliving birth and going through the experience of psychospiritual death and rebirth. We would see people who would have past life experiences and benefit from them. We would also see people who have archetypal visions of deities or some demonic presences, or have experiences of paradise or heaven or hell, for that matter. So if we see these kinds of experiences in people where they came spontaneously, we don't see why we should not try to work with them in the same way that we work with these experiences when they come up in the breathwork or in psychedelic sessions. We have over the years worked with many people and who were able to get successfully through these crises and actually benefit from them. So this is the first criterion. The other criterion is whether the client sees that process or is able to see that process as something that's happening inside of them, rather than using what we call projection, which means blaming it on something that their neighbor is doing, or mafia is doing, or the Martians are doing, and so on. So maybe I'll just give you an example that we use in our books of two clients that would come, one with a state that we consider good for alternative approach, and the other one that it probably couldn't help very much, that would have to be maybe hospitalized, tranquilized. So the first person whom we would consider a good candidate would come and tell us, the last 3 weeks I have been having powerful energy streaming up my spine. I have visions of light. Sometimes it seems like it's mythological visions. I wake up at night and it seems like I've been in another country at another time, or sometimes these experiences emerge in everyday life. What's happening to me? Am I going crazy? So this person would talk like somebody, a quote unquote normal person who just had 300 micrograms of LSD or came from a holotropic session, and it's telling us in a very articulate way their story. Although the content of the story might seem wild, reliving birth and having had past life experiences, and seeing mythological beings and so on. But this would be, a good candidate. The second client would come and say, you know, I have this really horrible neighbor. He hates me, he's trying to destroy me. He made a tunnel into our house, and it's at night it's getting into my kitchen, it's poisoning my food. When you ask that client what reason the neighbor has to do that, they would say something like, well, he's really on the payroll of mafia, the mafia people are trying to destroy me. And actually the money is coming from the Middle East, it's the petrodollars. So you get a sense that's a very, very different kind of story. Actually in you know, traditional psychiatry, they considered the strange feeling that they get from the patient as one of the indications to make a diagnosis of schizophrenia. Schizophrenia originally was called dementia praecox. So what they were calling it, when you sit with your clients, you get praecox Gefühl, which means you cannot relate to what they are saying. Now, the psychiatrists and psychologists who had psychedelic experiences, they don't have praecox Gefühl, or, you know, feeling that they deal with something psychotic. They have the feeling that the client is reporting the experiences that they themselves experience. The same with the holotropic breathwork. People who have been in workshops or in training, holotropic breathwork, they recognize this material and they feel optimistic about doing something with it. So those are the criteria. Then another thing that you want to know is if you can develop, or if you have a good relationship, good contact with the client who is reporting this. You also want to know that there is no medical problem that would need it really traditional kind of medical treatment. And then another thing is that the patient has to be willing to do experiential work. If you tell them about the alternatives, you know, to give them something that they just would feel better, they could sleep better and so on. And the other possibility, the first possibility would not really change anything. And the alternative would be to go through a lot of challenging experiences with our support, but there is a good chance that they would actually benefit from it. And then you can give the patient these two alternatives. And they might say, you know, I have enough of these experiences, just give me something so I get it out of my life. And the other patient gets excited. Maybe their own spiritual emergency started when they used some powerful spiritual method of meditation. So this is the question of, you know, differential diagnosis. We cannot make the differential diagnosis because we don't have a clear psychiatric medical diagnosis, but we can define certain elements in the experiences of these people that we feel make them good candidates to at least try an alternative approach before we would do you know, medication and hospitalization and so on. The problem there, of course, is that there are really close to none of the psychiatric facilities that can offer 24-hour treatment without using tranquilizers. But the other thing that we looked at was, you know, what were the triggers? What were the things that happened in these people's lives immediately before they started having these holotropic experiences? So one category of these kinds of triggers that we found were of a physical, of a biological nature. Those were experiences like an operation, an injury, an accident, a disease. that sort of lowered their defenses. There could have been a period of long exertion, fasting, sleep deprivation. Then another thing which was a frequent trigger for this was childbirth. This is actually what happened to Christina when this process of Kundalini awakening started, and then also got further activated during her second delivery. And then we have also found people when it was a powerful sexual experience that started the spiritual emergency. For example, we had in our month-long a woman whose Kundalini started after a very powerful, very positive actually, sexual experience. And then she decided to write a dissertation about it, and wrote about a number of people that she talked to whose Kundalini was awakened in a very powerful sexual experience. Now, the second category of triggers, those would be psychological, emotional reasons. For example, loss of an important relationship of a parent, of a child, of a friend, or loss of an intimate relationship, loss of property, loss of a job, a series of failures. Another thing that we have seen was some involvement in spiritual practice. So those were spiritual triggers, if you want. So people who participated in some spiritual retreat, particularly again if it involved fasting or sleep deprivation or an extended period of meditation. So we saw people who practice different forms of yoga, Kundalini yoga, Raja yoga, Hatha yoga. We have seen this in people who had in Buddhist practice this very challenging experiences when it was in Vipassana, Zen meditation, Vajrayana. We have seen spiritual emergency that were triggered in some shamanic rituals, for example, participation in the sun dance of the Lakota Sioux people. So those are all triggers. Now, as you can see, this covers a very wide range, biological triggers, psychological triggers, spiritual triggers. So the question, what is the common denominator? What is the common final pathway? How should we understand what is happening here? So I believe that we can understand it so that all these triggering situations that I described actually change the relationship between the unconscious and consciousness in terms of either lowering the defenses so that the unconscious material starts surfacing, or it gives a boost to the unconscious. For example, this can happen after a poorly resolved psychedelic experience or session with some kind of a powerful experiential method of psychotherapy. There also seems to be some relationships between the degree of our involvement in the external world and our focus on the inner world. For example, as long as we have a positive perspective, we see the goals in our life that are reasonable, that we can pursue, getting a bigger house, car, getting enough money, and so on. We are pursuing the American dream, if you want, and don't pay any attention to the inner process. to a great extent, it can help us to keep our attention outside and not really get involved in the contents of our unconscious. If the positions in our external world start collapsing, we just lost a very important relationship. We just went through a difficult divorce. We lost a job, or you know, the overall situation is changing so that our perspectives are increasingly lower. Then what happens, we are thrown back to our unconscious. It gives the chance to the unconscious material to surface. And the different types of spiritual emergency are actually different combinations of the content from the unconscious emerging into consciousness. Some of the powerful emotional memories from childhood, from infancy, the memory of birth can start surfacing. We go through a psychospiritual death rebirth process. We might experience past life experiences or something coming from the archetypal realm, from the collective unconscious. So the kind of situation we are going through now, where somehow people have the sense that their perspectives in the world are kind of getting more and more dismal. You know, the economic opportunities are, we think, the overall economic situation doesn't look great. When they study college, they don't have great chances to get a good job. I believe this is all terrain that can increase somehow the incidence of these spiritual emergencies. Then we looked at the different types of spiritual emergency that we saw in people, and we found that, of course, you cannot create some kind of very clear demarcation, because ultimately all these crises are coming from the unconscious, activity of the unconscious, and the unconscious itself is kind of a unified field. You know, there are no demarcations, there are no pigeonholes there. So when the unconscious material emerges, it will overlap with some other domains in the psyche. So we couldn't do anything that psychiatry is trying to do very unsuccessfully in the diagnostic and statistical manual, to create some kind of a clear diagnosis. But we saw that there are certain sort of typical accumulations of symptoms that make it possible for us to define certain types. But there will be the overlapping, certain elements would be appearing in more than one of these types of spiritual emergency. But we came with about 11 of such categories that we can talk about as sort of distinct types of spiritual emergency. So the first one that we saw happening quite frequently in people was very similar to what we discussed as the shamanic initiation crisis. So those were experiences when there are very powerful confrontations with the perinatal domain. There is experience of going into the underworld to go through some very challenging, painful experiences, painful emotionally as well as physically. Then experience of annihilation, sometimes dismemberment, as we saw it in the slideshow in one of the earlier modules. And then after the experience of death and annihilation, the experience of rebirth and some kind of a magical flight into the supernal realms. I described the symptomatology of this earlier, you know, becoming a solar bird and flying to the solar realm, or being carried by the bird, or you know, climbing a rainbow, or some other way of ascent, then experience psychosomatic healing, learning how to learn or getting an idea how it should be done, and then connecting with nature, with real animals, with archetypal animals, power animals, and so on. Again, we had the earlier example of the woman who experienced in a holotropic breathwork that she had a horned owl as a spirit animal, and then later had the experience of finding the remnants of an owl and then actually picking up a wounded owl and taking him or her home. So we had situations where people would have repeatedly these kinds of shamanic experiences in their sessions, to the extent that they decided to go and connect with a shaman and become apprentices of shaman, or experiences, some shamanic rituals. And there were psychologists, psychiatrists who actually introduced some of the elements of shamanic healing into their own practice, or they decided to join the Foundation for Shamanic Studies that was developed by Michael and Sandra Harner. So this is one very, very powerful, very common type of spiritual emergency. The second one I already mentioned, that Christina was going through these episodes that we finally diagnosed as awakening of Kundalini, and we learned how to work with it. So this is a type that was in the Western literature was described by Lee Sanella, who was a psychiatrist and ophthalmologist working for the Kaiser Foundation in Oakland. And he noticed that some of his patients who came for ophthalmological problems, they also had a number of the phenomena that were described in the ancient Indian literature as signs of awakening of Kundalini. He was familiar with Indian literature. And this in combination with the fact that there were negative findings, ophthalmological findings for their eye problems, led him finally to write a book which was called initially Kundalini Psychosis or Transcendence, and then later was republished as The Experience of Kundalini Psychosis or Transcendence. It was very interesting that Jung became quite involved in the problem of Kundalini, to the point that they had series of seminars in Küsnacht in the Jungian Institute, and he concluded with a statement that actually became one of his major mistakes in his career, when he concluded that Kundalini was an exclusively Eastern phenomenon, and that it's probably going to take like 1,000 of years before the Kundalini starts moving in the West as a result of people being involved in depth psychology. And very shortly after he made that statement, Lee Sanella started collecting these cases and came up with several hundred of them. So what is Kundalini and what is Kundalini awakening? In the Indian ancient literature, Kundalini is described as the creative force of the universe that is feminine in nature. And we have in our body, in the subtle energy body, we have a representation of it in the sacral area, where it is in a dormant form. In this dormant form, it is represented as a snake coiled 3.5 times around the masculine symbol called Linga or Shiva Lingam. The term Kundalini means the coiled one. Now the the basic idea in the Indian literature is that this dormant Kundalini can get activated by a variety of situations. The most common would be getting what's called a Shaktipat, awakening of the Kundalini. The activated Kundalini is called Shakti. And when it gets activated, it flows up the nadis, these channels of spiritual energy. The main nadis are Sushumna, Ida, and Pingala, the central column, and then the feminine and the masculine energy. And they are usually represented like the staff of Asclepius, sort of, rising and crossing. And where they cross, there are the chakras, the centers of spiritual energy. There are also conduits of this energy. They come, counted to thousands that create the energy body that reaches far beyond the skin. And this is something that can be visualized. We can experience it in holotropic states of consciousness. And we will certainly be returning to this in future modules. So one of the possibilities of activating of Kundalini is the Shaktipat. Another one could be, powerful spiritual exercises. For example, this was described in the book of Gopi Krishna, which became very, very famous, where he experimented, with meditation for years, and then his Kundalini became activated, created very challenging situation for him, but then ultimately he benefited from it, and he was trying to bring this knowledge of Kundalini to Western culture, Western industrial civilization. There are some, very forceful ways of arousing Kundalini, which certainly are not recommended, which would be like, pressing the carotids and block the influx of the blood to the brain and so on. We have also seen it quite frequently after childbirth or activated in childbirth, which is what happened to Christina. And I already mentioned the person in our Mantlog. I can mention her name because she published it as a dissertation, Barbara Mermont. We have seen quite a few people where this was actually activated in a sexual situation. There's a close connection between Shakti, the spiritual energy, and the sexual energy, which is then used in Tantra, the left-handed Tantra, Vama Marga. Now the Kundalini is seen as a beneficial energy, and it's one of the examples of what I described as the self-healing intelligence. There's energy which is activated in the organism that somehow activates the painful imprints, traumatic experiences, and brings them into consciousness for processing, and eventually results in spiritual opening and spiritual transformation. It's recommended in the yogic literature not to fight the Kundalini. If you fight it, it's very similar to what's described in shamanism. It can end up in disease or psychiatric disturbances, described as insanity and so on. So the idea is it's important to cooperate with this process of Kundalini. Okay, then we defined a third very, very distinct type of spiritual emergency, actually one that does not usually present major challenges to the people who have it, but they get hospitalized because of how they appear to their families, to their friends, and then, of course, to psychiatrists. This is an experience that Abraham Maslow described as peak experience. So this is Abraham Maslow. Abraham Maslow, who himself had this type of experience and saw that it actually was very beneficial, and decided to study people who had these experiences, and again accumulated several hundred of these cases. So it is an experience of spiritual opening that does not present major challenges. Now, Walter Pahnke, whom we talked about already in connection with the Good Friday experiment at Harvard, when he gave psilocybin to students of theology, he went to the spiritual literature and created a questionnaire for these experiences that we then trying to identify in people who had psychedelic sessions with LSD, MDMA, dipropyltryptamine, and so on. And these are the categories that he described as essential for defining something as a peak experience. So a significant part of it is feeling of unity, which is inner and outer. Somehow we have the feeling that, you know, we don't experience our body as sort of a compilation of selective feeling, but that we feel sort of healed and unified inside, and then feel also that the boundaries with the environment melted. We becoming part of nature, part of human society, a part of the cosmos, part of the divine aspect of the universe. The second characteristic was sense of sacredness, or what Jung called numinosity. He preferred to terms like spiritual, mystical, magical, and so on, religious. The next one is paradoxicality. The people who talk about these experiences talk in things that seem paradoxical, sort of incompatible. For example, I felt that I became nothing, but by becoming nothing, I became everything. Or I saw around me that all forms of the material world were emptiness, but I also saw that in emptiness there are forms. It's a very, very Buddhist statement. Or I know that I'm an insignificant part of the universe, but I also saw that I am the entire universe. Or I knew that I was separate from others, but then again, we were all one. And I try to explain this kind of paradox and clarify when we look at the holograms in one of the earlier modules. So paradoxicality. Another category is ineffability. People who talk about these experiences complain that they cannot find words for it. We don't have language for describing these experiences because we developed our language in communicating with each other and with the material world. And sometimes they resort to either Sanskrit terms or Japanese terms or Chinese terms when they talk about prana, chi, ki, or maya, or samadhi and things like that. Using the language of cultures that were much more sophisticated in the exploration of special states of consciousness. So ineffability. The other one was objectivity and reality. When we have that experience, we feel that what we experience is real and actually more real than what we know in everyday life. we might have the feeling that we actually awaken, that the everyday life is more like a dream, more like a hypnosis, as Roger Walsh called it. That we somehow live in an illusion, and then in these peak experiences we really get a more accurate understanding of what the universe is about. We also can get access to information which is of cosmic relevance, where we don't get any specific information about the aspects of material world, but we get some kind of a overarching understanding of the universe, of who we are and what it is all about. It's called Prajna Paramita. In the Upanishad, they talk about the knowledge of that, the knowledge of which gives you knowledge of everything. That doesn't mean that you learn mathematics or biology or physics or medicine, but you have a global sort of understanding of the nature of reality and your own nature. Then they had another one, which was the positive after effects. We have seen it in a number of situations where people have holotropic states, you know, in near-death experiences, in mystical experiences, where they had a sense of spiritual opening to a universal, all-embracing spirituality, when they have an increase of intuitive insights, ESP kind of phenomena, where they change their hierarchy of values, they changed their strategy of life so that it started to resemble Wu Wei, the creative quietude, as it is called, the Taoist approach to existence and so on. So these are Pankey's categories describing Maslow's peak experience. So this is, you know, the experience that people should not be hospitalized for. According to Maslow's findings, if it's allowed to run to a completion, it actually results in healing and also in what we call self-actualization, self-realization, to be able to use much more one's own inner potential in operating in the world. The next one is very, very important. This was described by John Perry, a Jungian psychiatrist, now late Jungian psychiatrist, who actually started two centers. One was called Diabasis in San Francisco. The other one was called Chrysalis in San Diego, where people, particularly people who had first episode that would be diagnosed as psychotic, could go, and they would not get tranquilizers. They would be allowed to go through whatever they had to go through. And John Perry would talk with them and try to help them integrate the experiences using the Jungian cartography of the psyche, collective unconscious, and also Jungian psychology. It's very interesting. He also used as personnel in his centers, both Chrysalis and Diabasis, people who successfully overcame a spiritual crisis. He saw it as a very special qualification. The opposite of what we see in psychiatry, where a psychiatrist having a breakdown or a nurse having a breakdown would be seen as disqualifying. So he felt that these people who have been successfully through spiritual crisis have a totally different understanding and capacity to support people than people who are just professionally trained, but they didn't involve any significant inner work. And now this is a powerful, powerful experience that most likely would be diagnosed as psychosis, schizophrenia. The people who are in this crisis, they have the sense that they are in the center of some phenomenal cosmic battle, you know, like a Manichaean kind of a battle, forces of light and darkness, gods and devils, so light and darkness, and so on. They have the feeling that they play some very important role, that they are center of this cosmic battle. They are preoccupied with the problem of death, for example, ritual killing, sacrifice, martyrdom, afterlife. They get fascinated by opposites, particularly gender opposites. They might have the experiences of becoming a member of the opposite gender. There is an experience of what Jungians called hieros gamos, sacred marriage, which could involve some archetypal protagonists. For example, the figures from alchemy, the king and the queen, or the sun and the moon, or we have seen people where it takes the form of Shiva, Shakti, actually, the feminine and the masculine, the higher aspects of what we experience as gender. Sometimes these get projected on a person in their environment, whom they see then as a soulmate, as a karmic partner, and so on. The other thing that happens, that at a certain point they start experiencing a radiant source inside of themselves, which has the characteristics of what Jung saw as symbols of the self. For example, a pearl, a precious stone, a diamond, or just a radiant source of light. And then towards the end of this process, when it starts quieting down, they're preoccupied with the number 4, like 4 cardinal points, 4 groups of people. They also have a craving for perfection. They see the negative aspects of life, what's happening in the world. They want to change the world in some positive way. And another thing that happens, they start spontaneously painting mandalas, which combine typically a square and a circle, the quadrature of the circle. And Jung was pointing to the fact that it appears in architecture, for example, the ziggurats in Babylonia, Assyria, or the ancient fountains, which have a square ground and then the round fountain. The circle is the symbol of the transcendent, of the permanent. The square is a symbol for the concrete, for the grounding of the experience. So for Jung, this was the idea that we're bringing the experiences, spiritual experiences that they had, and they're now bringing them into their everyday life and trying to ground them. So John Perry called this experience renewal through descent to the central archetype, which was the archetype of the self. Now, in his understanding, actually the perspective was opposite to what we have in psychiatry, where the intense experiences are seen as the problem, as the something that had to be stopped, that had to be suppressed. John Perry saw actually the earlier personality, the impoverished personality of the client, that was the result of traumatic childhood, traumatic experiences. He saw this as the problem, as the pathology, and this major sort of breakthrough was actually the healing process that should be supported. Now, a very theoretically important aspect of this that John Perry, as Jungians are, was very well educated, and he recognized that these experiences that I described, that these people were having, actually were identical to what you find in ritual dramas that were conducted in cultures at the time of what he called archaic era of incarnated myth. This is a time when the culture believed that their ruler, their leader, is actually God, not an ordinary human being. So this would be the time of the pharaohs. The pharaohs were seen as gods walking the earth. The Incas were seen as gods. The Hittite kings, for example, the Hebrew kings, and so on. So at the time when the culture believed that the ruler is God, at the time of the New Year's festival, they enacted a powerful drama in which the king was in the role in which now the people in this type of spiritual emergency experience themselves. Now, this is a powerful argument against the idea that you find in current psychiatry, that this is a psychotic process. You know, what kind of psychotic process would create kind of something that resembles a drama that was performed at a very specific period of history? It's very, very unlikely that any pathological process would be able to create the kind of material that we find in the collective unconscious, the archetypal material, the experience of the various domains, the heavens, the hells, the purgatories, the divine beings, and so on, or the demonic beings for that matter. So John Perry saw this as something that was related to the evolution of consciousness. And he saw it as a kind of democratization of the process, where in these cultures in the archaic era of incarnate myth were seen as the only people who were really gods walking the earth. In this process, people discovered their own divinity. You know, whoever they are in everyday life, they can experience themselves as divine. So that's a very, very important, practically and theoretically important process that has the least chance that it would be embraced, you know, as a spiritual emergency rather than psychosis that needs to be suppressed. Now, emergence of a karmic memory is another very important type. Initially, the karmic memory can start emerging in certain fragments that the people who are involved in this process start having certain visions that don't make any sense, or suddenly there's a wave of emotions that are sort of out of context. So they come to a place and they have the feeling of déjà vu, that they recognize this locality. Now, when the memory then emerges fully, then you know, they could be hospitalized just for the experience itself if they come asking for help, or they can get into trouble by acting out, by projecting this experience. For example, they would see somebody in their environment as being a soulmate or being a karmic partner, that they saw it in their experience, and then they are trying to convince that person that they shared a past lifetime and how wonderful it was, and they want to recreate it in this life, and they get into troubles. So this can also be, you know, a reason to hospitalization. They can, you know, the problem is what related to a stalking and so on. Now, the next important category is the category of near-death experiences. I will not go through the specifics. I'm sure you're all familiar with it. You know, sort of the going through the tunnel, seeing the light, going through the judgment, and so on. Becoming the Bardo body can have experiences of astral projection, perceiving things in other places, and so on. But why should near-death experience be a reason for spiritual emergency? This is something that can happen very suddenly. You can have somebody who has absolutely no spiritual interest, let's say a president of a big company, and goes jogging and has a heart attack, and within seconds would be catapulted into this fantastic world where they could be, you know, divine judgment. There could be visions of celestial cities and so on. And then coming down and not getting any support, any explanations, and feeling really confused by not being able to reconcile what they have experienced and what they know from everyday life. So again, this is hopefully decreasing because the knowledge of near-death experiences is you know, very widely spread. The whole concept is popularized. We have TV shows and movies and so on. But still, people you know, don't get in most places effective psychological support where they come down from these near-death experiences, or when they experience it, you know, part of dying. Another one I would like to mention is crisis of psychic opening. I have in my book, When the Impossible Happened, the story of Anne Armstrong, very gifted psychic who went through 20 years of challenging experiences before an amazing psychic gift opens. She was one of the most grounded and reliable psychics I have ever met in my life. You could give you a reading by telephone. You just give her the name of the person that you want the information about, and she would tell you a lot about that person that you know, and some of the people, some of the information that you don't know about these people that would be absolutely accurate. We had her in our month-longs very frequently, and she came usually in the third week after time when we spent, you know, a long time together, and we did holotropic breath work and group sessions and so on. And she knew more about the group than we knew after these 3 weeks. She came up with some really amazing and very accurate insights. So the increase of intuitive capacity, the increase of ESP phenomena is something that happens in many forms of the spiritual emergency. You see this overlap that I was talking about, but this particular type has just this opening of the psychic abilities as almost like the main symptom of this type of spiritual emergency. So this would involve precognition, clairvoyant insights, psychometry, you know, getting information from objects. Even we have seen telekinesis, kind of poltergeist kind of phenomena that happen. Out-of-body experiences are very common, where people feel, you know, that they're out of their body, maybe watching themselves from, and the whole scene from above, or even having astral projection and experiencing something that happened in distant locations. So this is something that's very common in near-death experiences. But here, you know, people can have it without having any kind of a biological crisis. I will just mention another type, which is possession state. This is a situation where people could be driven to all kinds of antisocial acts, heavy drinking, drugs, promiscuous sexual activities, even illegal activities of various kinds. And then sooner or later they start having a sense that there is some kind of a dark, evil energy that even seems personified. And then it can actually erupt in everyday life, which would of course end up in hospitalization, or we have seen it many times in psychedelic sessions and in holotropic breath work. Now, usually people would not want to talk about it as spiritual, but this dark side of existence is certainly something that belongs to the spiritual realm. It's the shadow side of the light, divine aspects of the universe. Again, I described in my book When the Impossible Happens, story of a client that I call Flora, where a major sort of possessive state emerged in the middle of a psychedelic session, where her facial expression changed, her physical posture changed. And it's actually this episode that lasted quite a while in the session, then led to a major transformation, one of the major improvements I've ever seen in a psychiatric patient. So we see this quite frequently in holotropic breathwork and in psychedelic sessions. We also added to this classification of these states alcoholism as being a spiritual crisis, as we know from the AA movement, the 12-step movement. And we also added there UFO phenomena, because many people who had the sighting of phenomena or experienced abduction, the way John Mack described in his book, The Passport from the Universe, and another book which was called Abductions, they can go through an episode of spiritual emergency. We have seen quite a few of those. So those are the types, and again, as I mentioned before, those are not clear types. They would be overlapping. Now then, about therapy, what can we do with these people who are in spiritual crisis? Now, sometimes the crisis is minor. People have experiences that are confusing, but they can still function. As I mentioned, we met in our lectures, in our workshops, in the training, many people who had spiritual emergency of one type or another, and they managed to handle it at home without seeking professional help and getting a diagnosis and getting traditional suppressive treatment. But it can also happen that the experiences are so powerful that people really cannot handle it on their own. So one of the possibilities is to offer experiential work, the way we did it in our own life, Christina and I, simply when the episodes come, to go and have an experiential session that can clear that until there is another episode. And then we can use the kind of same approach that we use in psychedelic sessions or in holotropic sessions, that we simply validate that state. We say this is a difficult stage of a process that can be transformative, that can be healing. We're going to be here with you and support you. And then we basically encourage people in these sessions to go deeper into it and express whatever they need to express physically or emotionally. And we might use body work to help the energies to get through. Now, if it's a really kind of a stormy, you know, process that doesn't come episodically, but is that kind of a continuous process, would need some kind of a 24-hour support. Unfortunately, there are no good facilities that I know. Most of them ended. Diabetes, Chrysalis, Soteria, and other centers for lack of funds, because even if the treatment in these facilities cost much less than a psychiatric treatment would cost, no insurance company would support this kind of alternative approach. And the facilities had to either live from donations, or people had to make private payments, which really significantly paralyzed the possibilities of offering this kind of a treatment. Some people who were trained, were capable to provide support, they actually created a situation where they take turns, and there are people coming to the home of the people who is going through it, so that somebody is with there all the time, and they then work with these symptoms. So they don't need a place, special facility that is equipped to do that. In our books, The Stormy Search for the Self, we describe a case of a woman we called Karen, who started having very powerful holotropic experiences at Esalen. And of course, Esalen is a place where people don't believe very much in traditional psychiatric treatment. So she was offered a room where she could go through this, in a place called South Coast, which is part of Esalen. And then we were taking turns. And Christina and I spent about 3 hours with her every day, and then other people were with her. This lasted 3 weeks. She really got through it and experienced amazing transformation that is lasting. We have met her quite a few times since. And she, talks about it as I cracked my mirror. She doesn't have the stigma of a psychiatric diagnosis. She's some embarrassment about it. And this was a very successful situation, in spite of the fact that we did not have really a cohesion. We did not have the same philosophy. Some of the people who spent time with her were trying to distract her, showing her flowers, or talking with her, trying to take her away from what is happening. Other people offered her massage and so on. So there was variety in these approaches. We make sure that we kept a diary where it was clear how much food she got, if she got the vitamins, minerals, if her personal hygiene was taken care of, and also continuity, because there were different teams coming. The continuity, what happened in the previous sessions, so that they could relate to it appropriately. What is the history of these kinds of approaches? I myself tried, when I was still in the psychiatric hospital in Prague, I tried to give actually LSD to several of the patients who were diagnosed as psychotic, and got them successfully through the episode with the opposite treatment that you would use, which is suppressing the symptom, actually accelerating the symptoms. This was based on the observation that actually it's the very acute episodes of holotropic states that have the best outcome. The worst prognosis is in episodes which are called oligosymptomatic. They have just a few symptoms, slowly, chronically developing. Then there is a powerful outburst of the unconscious material, in many instances, even in traditional facilities, it ended up in a condition which was better than the condition before this breakdown. And you find references in the literature talking about the fact that the people who had the best prognosis were those who had acute episodes, and this involved specific experiences, for example, dying and being reborn, the psychospiritual death rebirth, or destruction of the world and recreation of the world. Those were those that had the best prognosis, even without this kind of focused alternative approach. Then, you know, in SLN, we developed this approach where we actually support people going through the process and doing body work. There was an experiment in the 60s, which was done by R.D. Laing, who became a very famous figure in the 60s with his kind of anti-psychiatry approach, where he basically felt that whatever you do, you should not do what psychiatrists are doing. And he saw that actually people who were diagnosed as psychotics had problems in adjusting to a sick society. So the society was sicker than the clients themselves. So this is Ronnie Laing with his one of his wives, Jutta Korbis. So as I mentioned, he became very, very popular, particularly for the counterculture, with the books that he wrote about the divided self, and you know, about alternative approaches to psychosis. And he created an experiment in London, in Kingley Hall, supported by the Philadelphia Foundation, where the patients were not treated at all. They were left in the room alone. This was very similar to a Japanese approach, which is called Morita, when they put patients in so-called psychotic episodes in a padded cell and then basically let them do whatever they want to do. So they did this in this Kingley Hall experiment. Unfortunately, the other kinds of support, the basic support for the patients were not ideal. And then there were these experiments of dialysis of John Perry, who was certainly providing basic care. He also repeatedly talked with these patients, trying to help integrate them. So we have this, historically we have this series of efforts, not doing anything, then letting them do it, but not activating the process, not working with the process, actually using body work and encouraging people to go through it. And then John Perry's approach gives this kind of help. And then the approach that we would consider optimal, which is actually, beside giving the full support to the patient or to the people who are going through these states, and actually actively supporting the process, encouraging people, and using the body work if the process is getting stuck, or if the power of the self-healing process is not strong enough to resolve the issues that are coming up. So the last thing that I would like to mention about spiritual emergency, it's sort of global significance as I see it. People who go through these spiritual emergencies with support, in other words, they they manage successfully to go through the experiences and ground them, they go through the kind of transformation that we have seen in successful psychedelic treatment and also successful holotropic breathwork sessions, which means they go through powerful transformation. They work through a lot of their deep-seated aggression, which is transformed, and they develop a sense of compassion, sense of belonging to the human species, feeling more connected to humanity, connected to nature, seeing our embeddedness in nature, that we cannot do anything bad to nature that would not simultaneously happen to us. They develop a sense of global citizenship, the need for global peace, global cooperation. They don't see violence as an acceptable form of solving problems. They have the sense that we should have a global constitution supporting life and supporting the environment. They develop a spirituality which is different from what you find in organized religions. It is non-sectarian. It is cosmic, universal, all embracing, very much the way you find it in the mystical branches of religions, the Christian mystics, the Sufis, the Hasidic Jews, or the Kabbalists, and so on. So it's a kind of a transformation that would certainly help the survival of life on this planet and survival of humanity if it could be applied on a large enough scale. And I mean, a very interesting and important step would be to create a system of facilities where people who are already going through this transformation, they don't need psychedelics, they don't need holotropic breathwork, they just need intelligent and educated support for the process that they're going through. We would see the transformation of humanity happening already spontaneously. Unfortunately, the people who go through it, they get diagnosis and suppressive medication. They're seen as the problem, not the people who are spinning these kinds of scenarios for nuclear war or sort of invading other countries and so on. Those are the real patients. We hospitalize and treat people for having past life experiences or experience of psychospiritual death, rebirth, or some archetypal images. So anyway, this is what I was able to communicate in this time that is certainly short for such a big topic. So I would like to refer to the book Spiritual Emergency, which gives you opinions of a number of people, or our book, the Stormy Search for the Self, where you would also find a bibliography where you would be led to other authors who have written on this subject. Since the time that we published these books and talked about it, quite a few other people contributed their own insights. So it's now pretty significant literature. And I'll also give you something in the deepening learning that you could read, and that would go beyond what I was able to communicate today. So thank you very much for your attention, and we meet again next Tuesday. Thank you very much.